Hey, you. Do not use Asian Americans as a tool to push your anti-Black bigotry. We do not need or want that.
Hello my viewers and welcome back to my channel. Now today we're taking a look into a crucial conversation about Asian American and Black relations. Inspired by the thought-provoking videos of Amy Chen, also known as Sekasfairy33 on TikTok. A huge shout out to Amy for sharing her insightful perspectives and sparking necessary discussions. Now, in her videos, she tackles the complex question, why do some Asian Americans harbor animosity towards Black people? She expertly navigates the nuances, emphasizing that both communities are not monoliths, but rather diverse groups with varying experiences. Now, Amy suggests that Asian Americans' prejudices towards Black people stem from the model minority myth, which grants conditional palm color privilege to Asian Americans, positioning them as a wage against the Black community. Now, this phenomenon, Amy argues, perpetuates palm color supremacy culture where Asian Americans are expected to uphold anti-Black sentiments in exchange for privileged status. Now, this quid pro quo arrangement undermines solidarity between Asian Americans and Black people, fueling division and harm. With that said, let's take a look at her interesting videos. I will be right back.
Last week, I attempted to answer the very loaded question of why Asian Americans hate Black people in very generalized and broad terms. And the reason why I chose to answer that question where it was at is because I believe when you open a hand in a gesture of understanding, you don't do it with a closed fist. And I felt that if I had rephrased the question in a way that was palatable for me to answer and said, I don't really think that there's hate, then it would have felt like gaslighting, which wouldn't open a conversation. But now that the conversation is open, I would like to go back and add some more nuance and depth so that we can reach a deeper understanding and hopefully move forward. I think it's important to acknowledge that the Asian American community and the Black community are not monoliths. Our experiences are widely varying, and reflected in that is my belief that there is not a general sense of hatred from Asian Americans towards Black people, so much as we represent a spectrum of racial prejudices based on our individual experiences, ranging anywhere from overtly racist and harmful to unpacking an implicit bias and making sure that we are not complicit in upholding white supremacy culture. But I do think that the one-sided oppression that the Black community feels coming from the Asian American community is rooted firmly in the model minority myth, which is a tool of white supremacy culture used to oppress the Black community. And it's not so much that the model minority myth grants white privilege to Asian Americans because Asian Americans are preferred under white supremacy culture. I think it's that it grants conditional white proximity to Asian Americans for the purpose of weaponizing Asian American positionality against the Black community. And while new wave immigrants may have arrived in the country with racial prejudice that they acquired in their countries of origin, there is no way that they could have known how their positionality was going to be weaponized against the Black community. And I think that that's most strongly felt in the Asian American businesses being run in Black neighborhoods. It's also important to note that the model minority myth itself marginalizes a lot of Asian Americans because a lot of Asian Americans don't fit the model itself. In fact, most Asian Americans do not. And other examples of how the model minority myth has been used not so much out of care for Asian Americans, but out of gain for white supremacy culture. Initially, when Asian immigration opened up, it's not because the United States really wanted Asian people here. They wanted access to the most educated Asian students, but it also wanted a source of cheap labor so that it did not have to pay Black laborers a fair wage. And with Japanese American reparations, it's not so much that the United States felt remorse for what it had done to Japanese Americans during World War II, as it needed to improve its reputation with Japan, which was becoming an economic superpower. And ways in which that conditional white proximity can be stripped away to make Asian Americans vulnerable was seen when Detroit auto factories closed and white white workers who were laid off were taking their aggressions out on Asian Americans. And then again in 2020, when frustration about the pandemic and concerns about the Asian American community organizing around BLM caused anti-Asian rhetoric and hate crimes to spike coming from the white nationalist community. And there are some Asian Americans who do feel that the hate crime bill was not signed to have any practical effect in addressing anti-Asian hate crime so much as a performative measure taken to say that the issue is done with. And I think it's important to realize that it's taken many years of hindsight to understand the mechanism by which Asian American positionality is weaponized against the Black community. And I acknowledge that a way forward is for us to be very aware of it, and that dismantling white supremacy will dismantle that system of weaponized privilege. I hope that makes more sense. Please be patient with me because there's so much here. I think the quick answer is that Asian Americans are given white privilege, especially the Asian Americans who fit the model minority stereotype. The quid pro quo for receiving that privilege is upholding white supremacy culture, which means being anti-Black. I was talking with somebody last night who was pointing out that the Civil Rights Amendment was passed in 1964. But also in the 1960s, the United States opened the door to Asian immigration. So now you have an influx of racial minorities who knew nothing about the history of white violence against Black people, knew nothing about the Black civil rights movement. So they arrived with civil rights, not understanding how that came to be. And also it effectively erased the United States' own anti-Asian history, because Asian Americans came in not necessarily knowing about the Chinese Exclusion Act or the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States during World War II. And I think that Asian Americans are used as a buffer between the Black community and the white community, because in the 1960s, there was almost a racial reckoning. The white power structure almost had to face accountability for the history of violence against Black people. But instead, Asian Americans were inserted and were pit against each other, so that we're always up against each other, and that basically like white supremacy escapes accountability. And the example that I think of that sort of started like the root of a lot of tension is Asian Americans were buying into the negative media stereotypes of Black people. And then in the events that led up to what became known as the LA riots, the LAPD kettled protests away from wealthy white neighborhoods and into Koreatown, and then they left. And we know how that played out. So again, the two communities being pitted against each other and away from the white power structure. And obviously the model minority myth is used to oppress the Black community. And there's so much here. I will be getting more into it, but I feel like that's the quickest answer that I can give that gets a little bit into the history. And I'm really curious to know what the Black community and Asian Americans feel about this. But please be patient with me. Thank you.
Now, according to research, since the initial arrival of Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, people of Asian descent have occupied a precarious racial positioning within the palm color supremacist racial order. As Kim's 1999 racial triangulation theory posits, Asian Americans and immigrants are intentionally elevated or marginalized relative to palm color people and other non-palm color groups to reinforce palm color dominance and privilege. Now, this racialization of Asian Americans profoundly shapes the opportunities, constraints, and possibilities of not only people of Asian descent, but all other groups deemed inferior to palm color people. Now, anti-Aratusism among Chinese Americans requires intentional national efforts to address internalized racism and anti-blackness within the Asian American community, given that palm color supremacy structures certain privileges based on perceived phenotypic features. It also includes confronting colorism of preference for fairer over darker skin tones, which is deeply rooted in Chinese culture and intertwined with existing anti-black sentiments. Now, since the end of World War II, many palm color people have used Asian Americans and their perceived collective success as a racial wedge. The effect minimizing the role racism plays in the persistent struggles of other racial or ethnic minority groups, especially Black Americans. Now, during World War II, the media created the idea that the Japanese were rising up out of the ashes after being held in incarceration camps and proving that they had the right cultural stuff, said Claire Jean Kim, a professor at the University of California. And it was immediately a reflection on Black people. Now, why weren't Black people making it, but Asians were? Now, these arguments falsely conflate anti-Asian racism with anti-Black racism, according to Kim. Racism that Asian Americans have experienced is not what Black people have experienced, Kim said. Sullivan is right that Asians have faced various forms of discrimination, but never the systemic dehumanization that Black people have faced during slavery and continue to face today. Asians have been barred from entering the U.S. and gaining citizenship and have been sent to incarceration camps, Kim pointed out. But all that is different than the segregation, police brutality, and discrimination that African Americans have endured. Now, many scholars have argued that some Asians only started to make it when the discrimination against them lessened, and only when it was politically convenient, amid worries that the Chinese exclusion laws from the late 1800s would hurt an allyship with China in the war against Imperial Japan. The Magna-Son Act was signed in 1943, allowing 105 Chinese immigrants into the U.S. Each year, as Wu wrote in 2014 in the Los Angeles Times, the Citizens Committee to Repeal Chinese Exclusion strategically recast Chinese in its proportional materials as law-abiding, peace-loving, courteous people living quietly among us, instead of the yellow peril coolie hordes. In 1965, the National Immigration Act replaced the national origins quota system with one that gave preference to immigrants with U.S. family relations and certain skills. In 1966, William Peterson, a sociologist at the University of California, helped popularize comparisons between Japanese Americans and African Americans. His New York Times story, headlined Success Story Japanese American Style, is regarded as one of the most influential pieces written about Asian Americans. It solidified a prevailing stereotype of Asians as industrious and rule-abiding that would stand in direct contrast to African Americans, who are still struggling against bigotry, poverty, and a history rooted in slavery. Now, in the opening paragraphs, Peterson quickly puts African Americans and Japanese Americans at odds. But as history shows, Asian Americans were afforded better jobs not simply because of educational attainment, but in part because they were treated better. More education will help close racial wage gaps somewhat, but it will not resolve problems of denied opportunity. Reporter Jeff Gore wrote last fall in the Washington Post, Asian Americans, some of them at least, have made tremendous progress in the United States. But the greatest thing that ever happened to them wasn't that they studied hard or that they benefited from Tiger Moms or Confucian values. It's that other Americans started treating them with a little more respect. Now, at the heart of arguments of racial advancement is the concept of racial resentment, which is different than racism. It is said that racial resentment refers to a moral feeling that blacks violate such traditional American values as individualism and self-reliance, as defined by political scientists Donald Kinder and David Sears. And racial sentiment is simply a tool that people use to absolve themselves from dealing with the complexities of racism. Now, I have to say that the perceived animosity between Asian Americans and Black people, I must admit that I'm not convinced that Asians inherently harbor animosity towards Black individuals. I don't know, I'm not sure. However, I'm glad that we're having this conversation as it allows us to explore the nuances and challenges prevailing narratives. Now, Amy Chen's insightful videos sparked this discussion, highlighting the model minority myth's role in perpetuating division between Asian Americans and Black people. Her analysis resonates, and I appreciate her courage in sharing her thoughts. Through my research, I've found that the relationship between Asian Americans and Black people is multifaceted. Historical context, cultural differences, and systemic racism all contribute to tensions. But I'm left wondering, What do you, my viewers, think? Do you also believe that there's inherent animosity between Asian Americans and Black people? Or are these tensions fueled by external factors such as the model minority myth and systemic racism? Share your thoughts in the comment section and let's have a conversation in the comment section below. Thank you for always watching and see you in my next video as I bring you another interesting video.